I want to give a disclaimer as I begin this morning, and that is to say, I am not going to dive into the parable of the prodigal and exegete it. I have a topic this morning, and I found a scripture that had some parallels. So that's an important distinction to make. Alarm bells were sounded throughout the religious world in the United States when the Pew Research Center did a religious landscape study, first in 2007 and again in 2015, and the results showed that membership in houses of worship in the US was declining more rapidly than ever before. They discovered that when survey participants were asked to identify their religious affiliation, a sizable portion chose the prompt none, which is where the name came from. The nones include a large umbrella of people. Some are atheists, some are agnostics, some are theists. And the research showed that 61% of nones believe in God. And I'm saying none, N-O-N-E. 61% of nones believe in God, and many of them consider spirituality to be a high value for them. In 2020, the Gallup Center did a poll, and for the first time in 8 decades, the 8 decades they've been doing the poll, only 47% of people in the United States claimed they belonged to a house of worship. It's the first time ever it dipped below 50%. If you look only at younger people, the stats are worse, with almost 75% of younger people saying they are not a part of a house of worship. Based on the Pew research, some sociologists coined the term the dones, people who still identify with the tradition, but are no longer a part of organized religion. The nones are those who claim no affiliation, even if they were brought up in a particular tradition. The spiritual but not religious are similar to those who are dones, but they don't claim affiliation with a tradition. So why have people been leaving organized religion in the United States? What should religious institutions be doing about it, if anything? Is our interest in this group a selfish one? Meaning that we need members to survive, so we better figure out how to woo them back or we're done for? If so, we have lost our way. The conclusion that many religious folk are drawing is that this all shows evidence of a greater decline, a greater spiritual decline in the larger population. But Father Adam Bucko is asking, what if the turn away from religion isn't about spiritual decline, but about spiritual awakening? What if people turning away from houses of worship are interested in lives of meaning and purpose and significance? At the conference I attended in April for Spiritual Directors International, I was introduced to Father Adam Bucko, an Episcopalian priest with quite a story. Father Adam was born in 1975 in Poland during the Polish Revolution. He realized he had 2 options in life. One was to become an activist, and the other was to become an alcoholic and numb himself to the horrors all around him. He describes feeling hopeless and said everyone around him felt hopeless. Early on in his life, though, he decided he was going to become an activist because he went to Catholic churches And 95% of people in Poland went to Catholic churches, and those were the only free spaces to express longings and truths and hopes. He said he took his hopes to those churches, and the amazing leaders turned them into prayers. He watched as the priests were the ones who had courage to say no to oppressive systems. And then the priests began being killed by the government, including the priest of his childhood parish. He's intentional about pointing out that saying yes to presence means saying no to everything that violates God's love. He ended up in New York City as an undocumented immigrant because his dad went to the US with only $20 in his pocket, and after a few years managed to create a life and then brought the whole family. Within a few years, Adam was experiencing PTSD, and all of the horror of what he had grown up with came up. He was advised by some spiritual teachers to go to a Hindu monastery to heal. He said in that place he met all kinds of yogis and gurus and spiritual teachers. He went to India at one point during that time to explore monastic life. And while he was there, he met a homeless kid who took his hand. And he says, in that moment, he experienced a complete shattering. He believes it was this kid that brought him back to himself. Instead of cloistering himself away in meditation and contemplation, he ended up living in a slum in India, working with street kids. And then he spent the next 15 years on the streets of New York City, working mostly with queer youth of color who were experiencing homelessness. When he first started showing up for kids, he talks about it and says he was much more like a therapist trying to help them with their problems. Most of the kids had been abused. Many had been kicked out of their houses by parents who were told by religious leaders to kick their kids out of the house. Many were engaging in survival sex, and trying to be like a therapist to them was simply not working. They would go right back to their survivalistic ways of living on the streets. So Bucko describes how he began approaching the youth just like he approaches prayer, bearing witness in a state of curious not knowing, something he learned from Roshi Bernie Glassman. He says this, as we allow ourselves to be there without buffers, and as we claim our own powerlessness, underneath is the presence of God willing to enter into our midst, to pick up the broken pieces and to transform them into something to offer the world. It wasn't clear, he says, who was helping whom. And that's what spiritual direction or spiritual mentorship is. Most religious people in the United States view queer youth of color who live on the streets as either dispensable or in dire need of salvation. So we either throw them away or we do whatever is necessary to convince them to come to church in order to be saved. Father Adam Bucko's experience with them was that while they were done with organized religion, which had caused most of them great harm, they weren't done with spirituality, and in fact had big dreams of living lives of meaning and purpose, and still believed they could meet God. They just didn't believe they could meet God in a church or a mosque or a temple. That's important to hear. Many people think they have a greater chance of meeting God outside of a church than inside of a church. In the studies of the religious landscape in America, it's clear that rather than being disinterested in all things spiritual, young people are showing the highest level of desire for spiritual connection than ever before. That's revolutionary. That's hugely important information for us to have. Adam Bucko, from his perspective as an Episcopal priest, does not believe our institutions are able or capable of initiating people into this experience. While I'm not sure I agree with him on that point, I am open to what he is suggesting are some ways. What people outside of religious institutions are saying is that religious institutions are not different from all the other oppressive systems in institutions. In other words, religious institutions are not offering a radical alternative. Houses of worship, of which we are one, are too concerned with money, rules, power, and how they will survive. Bucko says that clergy are constantly trying to tell him that young people aren't interested in church or God. And Bucko finds himself constantly disagreeing with them. His experience is young people are interested in God or spirit or higher power, but that what they're telling him is they don't believe they're going to find that in a house of worship. Bucko says, so what they're telling me is that Christ has left the building. In the parable of the prodigal son, as it's often referred to, one of the most compelling scenes is when the son, who is gone for years, decides to return home. And we get this image of the father who has been waiting in love over all these years for the return of the son. And when he finally sees him way off in the distance, he gets up and he runs toward him, despite the fact that in his culture, a father would never run like that. If people have left the buildings and want to return spiritually, but not necessarily by coming back into the building, are we willing to run out and meet them? Or are we a little bit more like the older brother, the older son, who claims it's not fair? And then are we going to insist they come back to us? We should not have to run out to them. If Christ has left the building and 75% of young people in the United States have left the building, how do we meet young people? How do we meet people of any age spiritually outside of church? Or do we even think we need to? Is it enough to just keep doing what we are doing inside our walls? what I find fascinating is that what these people want, these people who identify as young, these people who identify as none, these people who identify as done, people who identify as SBNR, spiritual but not religious. What they want is to experience the holy. Maybe they call it the sacred. Maybe they call it the divine. They want the experience of this incredible presence. And honestly, I don't think many of us are much different. Don't we all want to experience that presence? Bucko says that as he witnesses, which, because we've learned the language of witnessing, we might say, because he witnesses, as he witnesses or shows up in a state of curious not knowing, he invites people to sit with two questions. The first question is, what breaks your heart? And the second question is, what makes you truly alive? He isn't pressuring people to answer those questions, but he's inviting people to learn how to sit with and hold the questions. He says what eventually happens is that our regular operating systems begin to crack a little, and then sometimes we have moments of insight when the holy breaks in, and we get alive, and we experience freedom, and we can see a much bigger picture. And then, if we can help people name what is happening, we can also introduce practices and sometimes even narratives if they fit. Regardless of whether you are here in person or online this morning, why are you here? What is it that you are hoping for or needing this morning? We often use the word connection, as in we're looking for connection with community, with people we have grown to love and appreciate, with God, with something bigger than ourselves that feels important. Working for justice in the world is an important part of who we say we are, and that's part of it. I often ask myself what we are doing on Sundays. And for that matter, what we're doing every other day. We are a mainline denomination house of worship in the United States. And like most of our sister churches, we still put a great deal of focus on what happens here on Sunday mornings inside of our church building. We're somewhat unusual, and I would say incredibly fortunate, in that we have a somewhat evenly distributed chunk of older people and chunk of younger people. But it would be easy for us, like so many other houses of worship, to get stuck on survival and self-perpetuation and all the things we need to do to make those things happen. And so we jump on this wheel of trying to attract new members so we can support our ministry and stay alive and maintain the building and house people who are experiencing homelessness. And sometimes it's worth stopping and asking, what are we really doing here? What are we saying is important? And what are we acting? What are our actions saying is important? One of the things Adam Bucko said that really stuck with me is that while so many institutions are talking about the spiritual decline in the U.S., he sees this as a time of spiritual awakening. He sees all of the people who are interested in spirituality in the experience of the sacred, the holy, the divine. And he has begun creating opportunities for people to be in community with others who want to experience the same. The question for us is, how can we help create and lead spiritual communities inside of and outside of our church building? A topic for another sermon is how many different spiritual styles people have and prefer, with nature being one of them. Nature is one of my top preferred spiritual styles, and that means I have a higher probability of experiencing God in nature than I do while I'm in church. Many of you are similar, and so are many people outside in the city. So why are we not regularly facilitating experiences in nature? Are we still too focused on what goes on in here? And how important is it to us that people believe a certain thing or things? How important is it to us that people officially join and become members of this church? And if those things are important, the specific things that people believe, joining and becoming members, if they're important, why are they important? At the end of the day, what is church? Who are we? Why am I a pastor if not to bear witness to the presence of God in all aspects of life? How are we doing that, and how are we being called, or might we be called to do that differently? Adam Bucko's response has been to create what are called new monastic communities. They're fascinating. I can tell you more about those sometime. A colleague of his has created spiritual communities called Nuns and Nuns. N-U-N-S, nuns, and nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And they are thriving spiritual communities all across the United States. Look it up online, Nuns and Nuns. If you want to check out Adam's community, look at spiritualimagination.com. Can we be like the father in the parable and run out to meet those we might be called to love? Can we imagine ourselves being spiritual mentors and bearing witness as we all sit with the questions, and then one day live into the answers of what breaks our hearts and what makes us fully alive? Amen.